Hello, everyone. Sucker here. Did you seriously just drop a piece of chocolate right as I began this?
I seconded.
Hello, everyone. Sucker here. I'm going to say this right now from the beginning. Welcome back to the History of Everything podcast. And also on that note, welcome to perhaps what is going to be one of the more chaotic episodes that you've heard in your life. If somehow you even managed to get through this in the first place, this is an episode in which we are literally here in Florence, in Italy, in a sweatbox of a room that, I kid you not, was literally being used by the hotel in order to store luggage in. We had to lower the AC in it so that it doesn't get picked up by the mics, but you're still probably going to hear a lot of cackling and giggling and other stupid crap that happens because simultaneously there is alcohol involved at this point. So, from any background, any noise that you hear in the first place, I'm sorry, there's literally nothing that we can do about it, but my editor is going to try and do his best regarding it. And simultaneously, thank you to all of you who've joined me here on this Trova trip. I appreciate each and every one of you who isn't here. So for everyone that is listening back here, and I know that we're probably going to get a whole bunch of feedback, but give a hooray.
Hooray! More booze.
Yes, and there's more booze.
I think we need to preface this with, sorry, James.
Yeah, sorry, James. I'm so sorry with this year. We have, I said from the very beginning when we were going to be recording these episodes that we were going to have a whole bunch of people, show up. We'll do a live recording of the podcast. I didn't expect 17 people to join us. But you know what? So be it. So be it. For today's episode, there's really nothing finer that we could possibly do to talk about than gladiators. Because, my friends, we are in Rome. Well, we're not in Rome right now. We're literally here in Italy, though. We are in the home of the gladiators. We are in the home of what probably started, I'm guessing for many of you that are probably listening to the podcast, and for many who are in this room, this is probably one of your first loves of history that you ever had, was specifically Rome and the Roman Empire. For some, it was World War II. For others, it was Rome. And for some, for whatever weird freaking reason, it might have been just like some obscure part of like Thai history. I don't know why that would be. Civil War. Fair enough. Fair enough. That's a fair point for this. But my friends, we are going to be diving into the history of gladiators. Going right back into the beginning of gladiators. We need to first point out in history that these were the great superstars, and their story of how they began is honestly a fascinating one. While this point is something that is heavily disputed, and I'm sure that many of you have probably already heard this kind of detail in here when talking about this, a number of historians have traced the origin of gladiators to going back to the Etruscans, or perhaps back to 264 BC, when Etruscan and Campanian rites of sacrifice were observed and then adopted by the Romans. Are you familiar with this? Is anyone familiar with like the really screwed up origin behind the whole thing with gladiators?
Yeah, because it's all about, because obviously human sacrifice was a huge part of a lot of the religions in the area. It's like, we could either kill them, just normally execute them, or we could have them fight to the death.
Literally, yes. That's the whole point. So you've all seen like in gladiator films when it comes to things or movies or games or whatever, where there's the whole like classic thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever. Does he live? Does he die? Whatever. Yeah, they almost always lived. You did not want a gladiator to die. You didn't want that to happen because, go figure. Yeah, there you go. We're getting the money signs here. We're in Italy, so the fingers that you're using right, that's exactly what it'd be doing. Except it also would have been like this when you make the Italian sound. They were freaking expensive to train, man. Like, you got to think, you have a person that is living in a society that is primarily agricultural based. They don't have nearly as much productive capability as we do nowadays, meaning that every person that is not on the farm, they damn well better be good at what they are doing, because otherwise it is basically a waste. So if you have a person that is trained specifically to be a soldier, to be a fighter, to be just that and nothing else, that takes a lot of time, effort, and money that is in a society that is not nearly as productive as we have now. You don't want to just throw that away on executing them. You use them as entertainers. Gladiators, from most of history, you could probably associate them as being closer to WWE stars. Are you dropping things back there? You could honestly associate them as being more like WWE stars than anything else, where there's still kind of a script that they're supposed to be following, but also shenanigans can still happen in it. Like, someone could just straight up get stabbed and die, even if that wasn't in the script, just like you could accidentally get hit in the head with a chair and it could break your spine. That wasn't part of the script, but it could have happened. It's still dangerous. It's still a reality, and it was a blood sport, though most oftentimes it was to first blood. The Etruscans, though, no. they had a particularly special right where, yeah, the idea that they had was that, let's say you had a wealthy individual who had slaves.
And the Etruscans being the people that lived in Florence before Rome was an empire?
Yes, so think of like Tuscany, Etruscan, like where it came from. So you had Rome, and then there was a series of, I believe it was 12 city-states that were to the north that were Etruscan. So it wasn't like just a singular Etruscan state, it was the Etruscan League. And there were Etruscan kings, like the initial kings of Rome were Etruscan, essentially, before the whole actual origin of things with, Romulus and Remus and whatever you want to trace back to the origin of Rome and how they got their independence. That whole thing is still up to debate. But their right was like, let's say you had a master who was quite wealthy, and then he died, and he had slaves. It was a common right as a form of human sacrifice to have those two slaves at the funeral of the master be given knives or some other sharp objects and be told to fight to the death. This was done for both entertainment and as a blood sacrifice, and upon the completion of that fight, the winner was congratulated and then also sacrificed.
Because it was seen as an honor to follow your master into the afterlife.
Yep, it was a total dick move, but that is the very dark and bloody origin of, or one of the theories behind it, for gladiators and blood sports. It's really messy, to say the least, here from the very beginning. But it is, I don't even know how else I can really begin to describe it. It's one of those things that these are characters that were seen as a multitude of things. True heroes. They were seen as wastes of space. They were seen as superstars. They were seen as objects of desire, which we're going to get into when talking about blood and sweat and how that was used as an aphrodisiac. So that's a whole other thing that's going to be going into this here. But either way, this is something that it's very complex. Anyway, upon adoption of these practices by Roman high society, this would change their preceding Monera, as the Etruscans would refer to this whole concept, and would lead to the games becoming more of a celebratory event to honor the death of a member of Roman elite society. This is something that they would use in order to specifically be able to celebrate, entertain, and give back to the public. The way that you put yourself forward in Roman society was not just by, having a lot of money. You needed to use that money. And you used that money by giving things to people from the form of the patronage system, and also even better, throwing mega fucking awesome parties. And that's how you showed the public that you were awesome.
Yeah, I think the concept was known as bread and circuses.
Literally, bread and circuses. That is the entire point. These are individuals that were warriors who were sought out at very high expense. They were very high paid, if you want to even use the term pay. Some were actual slaves. Others specifically sold themselves into the system in order to specifically be able to earn money and fame from it. And the early stadiums of these celebrated and sacred combatants were typically akin to a hollowed out bathhouse in size, with very crude arenas. It wasn't like what we saw when we all actually went to the Colosseum, which, awesome. Most of these were essentially simple dugouts. And then as the Roman state would expand, then over time they would become bigger and bigger, with stands sitting beyond tall fencing or walls near the town or city center. Later arenas, of course, when we talk about this, were significantly larger, much, much larger, with one of the largest gladiator arenas found in Switzerland having a grand area that measured 500 by 600 feet with a seating capacity of 70,000, which is pretty substantial.
Sorry, it also gives a different meaning to how going on a Swiss holiday.
Yes, it also gives a whole meaning to Swiss holes in your cheese when your body is the cheese.
Did this arena have a name?
Actually, I don't have one for this. In fact, a lot of the stuff for Switzerland didn't survive, unfortunately. Like it just straight up didn't. They were still, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I still remember a documentary that I had seen years ago that was finding techniques on Roman storage, that they found all these pits in Switzerland that dated back specifically to the Roman era, that they tried to figure out for years what it is that they did, only to discover that they were basically like cellars for the Romans to be able to, they were heap pits where you would throw agricultural produce and stuff into and then essentially bury over in order to keep them cool and actually last a decent amount of time. And that took years to figure out in the first place. A lot of the stuff has unfortunately just disappeared. The warriors that would initially fight in these kinds of arenas were initially captured soldiers of foreign wars, most notably from regions like Gaul, Germania, Thrace, Greece, Scythia, Samnites, Carthage, etc. And initially, they lacked the presence of true Roman citizens. So while they were used for entertainment, they weren't necessarily respected very much. Now, while oftentimes a modern myth, serving as a gladiator was, much like the modern belief, to be used as, blood on the sands of the arena for entertainment of Roman socialites and as a tool of appeasement for politicians that were seeking to gain political favor among its citizens. Now, this trend, when we were talking about it, this is something that would progress for 220 years, with generations of gladiators becoming exceedingly more victimized by crude treatment, poor living conditions, and exceptionally underappreciated valuation by Roman citizens unless they managed to perform at the highest possible levels. It really did vary upon where you exactly were. But those with extremely dominant, courageous performances, these were lauded. And if you were one of those individuals, you could get famous. And that was something that would really, really change what could possibly happen to you. These were given better living quarters. They were given access to women, which, yes, no, I'm not only saying this, and I know it's going to make the thought of it very uncomfortable, but we're living at a time in which, sexual slavery and everything was a thing. So if you performed well, you would literally be given a woman. It's kind of the whole point of it. Yeah, my wife just was over on the side just asking for just this for free. For anyone who was wondering why Gabby is not up here in the first place right now, you've probably heard from her podcast episodes here on The Mystery of Everything, and also from random times when she's talked about it on this one. But she has social anxiety, and we are sitting in a Italian sauna box right now.
So we're up to 19 in the room now.
So we're... Oh, yeah, no, we moved from 17 to 19 now as more people have filtered in. And this is out of a group of what? We had 20...
If we count Marco, 24.
24 people, and 19 of those are in this room.
It's a very cold sauna.
It's a very cold sauna, relatively speaking. Yes, indeed. So, yes, they were given women, essentially, whether those were Roman-born women or those that were simply from, like, brothels and slaves. And from there, they had the ability to roam within their host city relatively unaffected by their bonds of service because they knew, hey, if I try to run away, I will be crucified. On the other hand, I get to boink pretty much whatever I want as well as get free food. So for them, it was a pretty sweet deal, especially since they were not nearly as likely to die, even if it was extremely dangerous. Then again, you compare that to working conditions for what it would be like in a 18th century Victorian factory, and honestly, your chances as a gladiator don't sound so bad. Still might both lose a finger, though, in that circumstance. That's definitely a very real possibility. Any questions that we have in here so far?
So with the Romans being, really extravagant on everything, I've heard that there used to be two kinds of Romans. You had the extravagant kind, and you had the people who always bailed out their friends who spent too much money doing these parties and throwing events.
Yes, that's 100% true. It goes back to the whole idea of the patron system. So in order to be anyone in Rome, it wasn't just a matter that you had money. It wasn't so much that you had power, but that you specifically used that power for or on behalf of other people. So the way that patronage worked is that the more people that you supported, the higher your place in society. The more dependents, the more patrons that you like, or that you would patron, that would be the better for you. Like, think of this here. You had the plebes and you had the patricians. Patron, patrician. It's the highest level of society. So the more that you support and give back, even if it's almost a parasitic relationship at times, that is still something that would elevate you. So if you had other wealthy friends, like, it's enough that you can bail out someone who's like, oh, a farmer who broke their leg and now they need support because they they can't feed their family here for the duration of while they're healing. That's something. But if one of the big families in Rome suddenly can't pay for something because some guy went on a drunken bender and then ran over someone with a cart and now has to pay the death fee, which, yes, that's a whole other thing because they could be legally sued in that circumstance. And we have records of people running over other people's slaves with carts and then having to pay for that because of it happening. If they couldn't pay the amount and you interceded on their behalf and gave the money, that elevated your position even higher because now they owed you. It was a big thing.
Yeah, wasn't a member of the triumvirate Crassus? He had like the fire department where he'd put out the fire at your house.
Oh yeah, he was the Godfather patron.
Yeah.
Crassus was the Godfather patron and everything. I believe that when going back into it, and I could have the number completely wrong off the top of my head because I'm just quoting this in here. He owned like 25% of the entire city, pretty much. Is like one guy. He was by far the wealthiest man in the entirety of the Roman Empire at the time, and much of it was done through essentially loan shark practices. So since he owned, there was no public fire department service. It was essentially teams of slaves, just like there was, technically speaking, you had the military, and there would be the vigiles. So you had their own kind of, that's where we get the term vigilante from. It's like the police forces that you would almost have, the firefighters, the volunteers, the individuals within the city. So what would end up happening in the circumstances is that he would have teams of slaves that would run a private firefighting force. And it wasn't so much that in a dry season that potentially someone could, have their house catch on fire. He was commonly associated with having fires spontaneously occur wherever his slaves happened to be. And so what would end up happening then is he would move in quickly afterwards to offer to save their house, but only if they would agree to sell it to him for a price that was way under market value. He would then, if they agreed, turn it around, flip it, and then rent it back out to other people for a much higher cost. What are you doing over there? Go right over here.
He's taking a massive squat.
There's now 20 of us in this room. Just sit down.
Come on.
Watch the wires, mate.
Listen, when I said we're getting hot and heavy, I meant that we're all hot and it's very and heavy people, okay?
After the meal, we'll all feel pretty heavy.
For anyone that just heard that, a rack just got knocked over.
All right. Where were we?
Okay, so where was it? I was talking about Roman women and brothels, and then we went on to this whole bender about this. Okay, yes.
And then you went on to the Roman Don Corleone.
Yes. So they were able to do pretty much whatever they wanted at that point, at least the higher paid, the more successful ones, as long as, they still maintain their service to their lanista. Which, speaking of which, the concept of a lanista, right? This is something that did not even exist in the first 50 years of gladiatorial existence. Like the initial trainers and cultivators of gladiators were captains, most notably equites, which for anyone, are you familiar with the divisions here in Roman society and status and how it essentially worked?
Yeah, because obviously the equites, like in terms of the Roman military, were the wealthy ones who could afford a horse.
Yes.
So they were the cavalry.
Correct. Yes, exactly. And so this is a very important detail. They actually had the money to be able to do stuff. So the trainers of these were equites. They were generals, members of nobility that required or desired their services. It wasn't until around 200 BC or so, as Rome itself is now expanding more rapidly at this point, that the first lanistas, the actual private owners and trainers of academies for gladiators, would exist. Like, God, imagine getting isekai'd to a world. And now in that situation, you're just in a fucking gladiator school, not a regular school.
You end up signing up for Vince McMahon's Roman Gladiator School.
Yep. And so this is where that starts to appear. Now, lanistas themselves were named as such due to their perception as purveyors of butchery. Lanius, like that's the whole point. And their tendency to pimp out those that were held in bondage, which, yes, that's another thing. This is not something that we're talking about necessarily for female gladiators. Those did exist, and that was a term called a gladiatrix. That was a thing. They were rare, but they did exist. But oftentimes there would be a number of wealthy Roman noblewomen who would take a liking to a particular fighter getting down and dirty and sweaty in the arena and would request through an intermediary the private services of said gladiator. Gabby, why are you looking at me like that? What do I mean by private services? What do you think I mean? A hand may have been involved and some shaking was involved as well. So it's kind of like Gladiator. Yeah, but here's the thing. When we talk about this with entertainers, and this is the thing for anyone who's not aware of this, entertainers, actors, actresses, for the longest time in history, they were whores. And I'm using that in the most blunt term that I can because that is the truth. Say what you want about modern celebrities or anything here whenever you see any kind of really crappy tabloid article about, people being scandalous or immoral or whatever. No, throughout the longest period of history, if you were an actor or an actress or anything like that,
Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the show, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, eBay Motors. eBay Motors is here for the ride. Remember when you first saw the potential, and then through some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own? With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure that your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, exhaust kits, turbochargers, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
you were a whore because more than likely because you didn't get paid enough on your services as a base entertainer. So oftentimes, whether it was ballerinas, whether it was theater, like stage performers of any kind, you made your extra money to live when some wealthy patron would go to one of your shows, see you, and then pay for your services under the table as you got onto the bed.
And it went for men and women.
No, it did.
No one cared.
It did. Now, later on, of course, you're going to associate it more with specific paying of, like, for females, like in the case of the courtesans, in the case of, like, ballerinas, exactly as you said. But in the Roman days and here, this is also something that was done on behalf of gladiators. Because, you know, they were their own form of entertainment when it came to blood sports. That would happen.
Just keep the blood sports out of the bedroom.
Exactly. So now the existence of lanistas is something that would endanger or would become endangered greatly as the years of games, the poor treatment and lack of true freedoms, even by Roman standards, which, you know, you had rights as a Roman citizen, but slave, not so much. This began to erode the passive nature that was entrenched in the training of gladiators. And it all came to a head in 73 BC when the gladiators that were housed within the ludus of Quintus Lentulus Batius, or Batius, I think that was his name here, colloquially referred to as Vatia, finally succumbed to the building reputation of a great gladiator by the name of Spartacus. And that is when everything then went to shit in Rome. You had a question.
You mentioned people would often sell themselves into the gladiator to pay off debt.
Yes.
At what point would they become a free man?
When they had paid off their debt, but that could vary because they could sell it for their services for a certain number of years or until a certain amount had been paid. The problem is that also the process of training to become a gladiator is expensive, which meant that much in the same way as for anyone who is members of the military, either listening or who are sitting in here now, you know how they make you oftentimes pay for extra stuff within the military, like dress outfits or anything else, or if something gets broken, you gotta pay to fix it yourself. They would do that same thing of, oh, well, we also paid for your food, for your training, for your lodging, for all this other stuff. And so that debt that you had grew bigger, and now you have a larger amount that has to be paid off.
Some guys, even if they have completed the debt, would stay on because, like, better life than what I had outside.
Yes, literally, that is exactly what would happen. For some of them, once they got a taste of the life here, they literally couldn't leave. It's like the equivalent of someone who, once they go into the military, once they get that bonus pay, that if they didn't have any skills or anything to go out of it, and once they get back into civilian life, many of them couldn't handle it. The only thing that they really knew how to do and what actually made them money was fighting. Also, they bought a Hellcat in the case of anyone who is in the modern military. The amount of people that could be listening to this podcast right now that are driving their Hellcat right now with its 18% interest rate.
They're all going, how did you know? I've got one question about the Equites. Obviously, that is a Reformation. Well, we'll call it reform.
The Marian reforms.
Yeah, Marian
yes,
reforms.
but the Equite class also existed all the way up until the end of Rome itself. So they still had these divisions, even if they were no longer codified within society as something that was done for the purpose of the recruitment system. So for anyone who's familiar with the system that the Romans had for military, you had the military divided into 3 base classes of infantry: the Hastati, the Principes, and the Triarii. And you had it from the youngest men in society, who were the poorest with the lightest equipment, who served on the front line, with the more experienced veterans who had been there. Maybe they're like 5-6 years older. They've had more time in the military, more time to get better equipment because they supply their own stuff the entire time. They are behind them. And then the Triarii are the oldest and wealthiest men of Rome, who would be the heaviest infantry behind them, which gives the phrase of something in Roman times. Going to the Triarii was like a final stand. It was to the last straw. They held out until the very end. It was the make or break moment. That was why that was a phrase. The Equites didn't count for any of that because they were the only Romans in the society who were wealthy enough to be able to own and feed and supply a horse, which is very expensive, especially back in the day.
And if you were too poor to be any of those, you were generally the velites and the archers, the skirmishers, and etc.
Correct. Though the Romans did not necessarily utilize many archers unless it was done in the form of mercenaries or auxiliary forces. The velites, however, would have been lightly armed troops who oftentimes would have had no armor whatsoever.
Is a pointy stick.
Yeah,
Go.
they literally would have had a short pointy stick like a little javelin, and then maybe a tiny shield, a little buckler that would have been on their arm that they could have tried to use to avoid or block things, but mostly they just have to use the ability to, what's the term? Get the fuck out of the way.
Dodge.
Dodge.
Yeah, literally, most of them would charge, throw the tiny spear, and go, I'm out of here, bye.
Yep, which is all they really could do in that circumstance. So yes, when going back and talking about things with Spartacus, as told by the Roman philosopher and historian Pliny in his retelling of the events, quote, "The then savages, held within the bondage of Vadia, plotted a scheme to assassinate both Batatius and the gallery of socialites and military leaders. While attending a gala prior to the major summer games scheduled to take place in Capua in the coming weeks prior to his escape, Spartacus and his contemporary, Crixus, they had established themselves as elite gladiators. And while the true reason for their plot and desire to escape is unknown and is something to this day that is disputed, it is acknowledged that the former, Spartacus, began to rise as a champion and an image of freedom and justice through his gladiatorial performances. And in doing so, he slowly radicalized his beliefs to those of breaking free from bondage from Roman slavery, what they wanted freedom from. Now, after breaking free from the ludus and terrorizing Capua and the surrounding farming and trade villages for a few months, he and Crixus then later progressed to forming a full-bore slave army and then advancing their cause throughout Rome for roughly 3 years. Like for 3 years, these guys are just running across Rome, burning, looting, pillaging, and freeing any slave that they can find to join their army until they eventually are halted and massacred by the first Roman triumvirate of Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey. Which I'm saying this right now here in the first place. This is a little side note because I know that I'm definitely going to have to do a future episode on specifically the servile wars, like the wars of these slaves. How stupid this was. Because Spartacus had his chance. He had his chance to run. He had his chance for freedom. He was right there in the north and he wanted to go. And the rest of his military, his officers, everyone who served under him with this here, they were like, nah, we're getting rich. We can do this, okay? If we just stay in Rome instead of fleeing north and then going over east into Illyria, we can stay here and continue to loot and burn and we can get a whole bunch of wealth and we're going to do that. So they moved south instead of escaping to freedom, which in turn gave the Romans time to do what they do best, and that is push away all the dead bodies of all their soldiers that they sacrificed before and raise a whole new army and then slaughter them, which they did. And that's exactly how that happened. So following the halt of the third and final Servile War, the Romans then spent an extended period of time with no games or gladiators, as the Roman Senate would establish strict limitations upon the number of gladiators allowed in the borders of the empire. Gee, I wonder why. Any questions on this so far from anything or comments?
Theoretically, if we turned up the AC, would they be pissed? It's just going to be a little shh. in
Please
the
turn up the
background.
AC. I'm boiling in here, and I can see. This is not as bad as the garage, believe it or not, for anyone who remembers this in here. Gabby, this is not as bad as the garage,
Garage in Kentucky summer.
but it still is pretty bad.
Once again, sorry, James.
Okay. All right. The lack of games and the subsequent, civil wars and everything that would follow would help to make things even more unstable. And shortly after the establishment of Julius Caesar as Aedile of Rome, he would order games to honor his father, who had passed 20 years prior, gifting 320 pairs of silver armor-clad gladiators to serve in the events, which is a big amount. It's a lot to be able to do here in the first place. But yes, he gave these specifically to the people of Rome. Later in 46 BC, Caesar would again honor his family by hosting games in honor of his daughter, Julia, who had passed 8 years prior. These games were highlighted by the presence of giraffes in the bestiary portion of the game, which was a first for gladiatory games in their then 220-year history of existence. They never had any before. And this would become a really big point for Roman gladiators over time. See, I know we're going to get into the different types of gladiators and talking about all this stuff as time goes on, but they had different classifications of things. So generally speaking, you know how there's that whole thing of gladiators being forced to fight animals to the death? Generally speaking, that wasn't done as much. You had animals that were specifically slaughtered, yes, and this was done for the sake of entertainment, much in the same way as the Spanish would do with bulls. But oftentimes, things like lions and other creatures were used to execute prisoners. So imagine it like a really fucked up version of a game of cat and mouse, where the human is the mouse and is getting toyed with. And so they would release political prisoners and convicts and sometimes foreign, captured military personnel or others be given no weapons or maybe a dagger and go, hey, go fight the bear.
Good luck.
Yes. And as you can probably imagine, they died a lot. And then what would end up happening over the time for this here is that as the animals would kill more and more and more and more, eventually it would reach a point where now, oh no, it looks like, oh crap, this gladiator is going to win. Oh, well, we'll just kill them both. And then they would do so. It's it's one of those really messy things. They would also get whole cases where animals would refuse to go out to fight because, they don't want to die. And it's not like they would have the lions that would go in there and they would go, hey, great job fighting. We're going to use you on the next round. No, the lion has to die. So they would just kill it. After it won a certain number of times and they didn't have anything else, they would just kill it instead of conserving it. Because, everyone wanted to see the lion die. That's kind of the whole point. Gabby looks horrified over on the side right now because anytime I mention anything with animals, for anyone, do you all remember the early episodes that we did? I don't know how long any of you have been listening to the show, but from the very beginning when we did the horrible military animal history or just horrible animal stories and the elephant that got hung from a crane. Yeah, that was one. She was very scarred on that day.
Did you ever do one about the zoo in Paris during one of the Franco-Prussian Wars? Siege of Paris. Everyone ate all the animals in the zoo.
Yes. Also, the same thing happened in Austria in World War II, where they had to do that. And over the course of World War I, actually. Yeah, a lot of those animals got eaten because of the food shortages in Germany and Austria.
And then in the first bombing raid of Berlin, wasn't the only victim an elephant?
I don't remember if it was the only victim. Can't say that off the top of my head, actually. So I'm not quite sure. As a result of the Third Servile War, the state of games, or the state of Rome itself, would play a greater role in the establishment, the maintenance, and distribution of games in an effort to avoid further revolutions. You don't really want that to be happening. This change of guard would lead to an establishment of imperial training grounds and a shift away from privately funded games that ran on Lanista's contribution to gladiators. Because if too many of these little upstart private citizens end up pushing their gladiators too far, the state doesn't have enough control over it. And as the shift came front and center to more Roman-controlled games, so too did the competitors in the games themselves also gain even more prominence as members of the gladiatorial ranks. These would be the Arugia. And the Aruga were Roman citizens that voluntarily went and joined a ludus for a variety of purposes. We talked about before about people that had to do so because of debt, which they were kind of forced into it in the first place. Others would just go, hey, I could make a bunch of money doing that, and people really like this, and they cheer for me. I'm going to do it. They, my friends, were the first attention horse. Well, not the first ones, but they definitely did go into it for many of them, specifically for attention. And that is what they would end up doing. They were individuals, as I said, who would voluntarily join a ludus, whether it was to escape their debts for whether criminal or personal purposes. And in the later years, many of them would join for, establishing a reputation and enjoyment of the competition, much like a modern day athlete. Because again, most of the time, it was safe. Minus a little blood, but it was safe, relatively speaking. So with this shift in membership among the ranks of the fighters, this would come a new focus in the way the gladiators were housed, fed, and supported on health and physical treatment levels. While the early years were predominantly done by slaves and spoil of war fighting in the name of their masters under bondage, the later years of the Roman games were highlighted by a shift to these citizens, and they would eventually become the dominant competitors. Like we see all this time in here where it would be like, you think of the classic Roman Empire, the point of capturing legions upon legions of slaves and then throwing them into the gladiatorial arenas. Yes, you still had ones that were sacrifice, but the really the entertaining ones, the gladiators, those were trained professional athletes specifically for that purpose. It wasn't the mindless slaughter that you would see in games, movies, and other things.
Obviously, in Rome, being richer, they could maybe lose a couple of gladiators because obviously they probably had enough money. But obviously, further out in the empire, having trained at gladiators was even rarer. So it's like, yeah, I ain't risking these guys.
No, you're right. And not only would that happen, but the gladiators, as they grew more and more famous, a number of them, even if they had lower status, still would end up getting families. They would still end up becoming ridiculously wealthy for some of them. They would adopt more of a rock star lifestyle than anything else. I talked about before that some of them, especially the slaves, would just be given women. Well, a number of them would quite literally get families. And you would have gladiatorial houses where even their families, their wives, quote unquote, if they were ending up married, or their children would even be allowed to live with them. And that was a circumstance that you did not see in the previous 100 years because that just wasn't something that you could have. So nearly as long as the Romans would hold gladiatorial games, they would also simultaneously revere the beasts of the world. And with them, they would include them in just about every game. They were held with, very brief pauses in animal participation from 27 BC all the way through 76 because, couldn't really do anything at that time when things were kind of plunging into the middle of civil war a lot. The games that were hosted at this time would then have a myriad of different beasts, some of which are now sadly extinct. Do you want to guess why? Overhunting for a lot of them. The amount of money that someone in North Africa could make by capturing a leopard or some other creature and transporting it to Rome was enough to set them up for life, basically, if they could get it. Or maybe not life, but the bigger, the crazier, the fancier the creature, the more so it was. Even elephants would end up getting transported to fight in arenas, and that was a very hard job to do because you either had to go one of two ways. You had to go all the way around North Africa, through Spain, up into southern France, and then around from the Alps, which you would have to do so only at certain times where it was actually viable to do so, or you had to go over the water, and then over half those elephants would die.
I imagine with the elephants after the Punic Wars, the Romans really enjoyed seeing elephants die.
Yeah, that was one of the things. If you could get an elephant into the arena, it was a huge thing.
Hi, are there any instances of giraffes winning? Because it's like horses with long necks.
Giraffes typically didn't actually. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't know about specific records in which they are recorded as winning, but giraffes could be territorial. And the thing is, if you get near them, they kick. Giraffes will fucking kick, and one of their kicks is capable of easily taking off someone's head. So yes, but also the reason that many of these animals were put into play was not to just see animals slaughtering people. That was done so in the case of like lions, tigers, or other things that would be used in order to slaughter prisoners of war or criminals or that kind of thing. But in the case of gladiators, it was way more entertaining for the public to see a small team of gladiators try to take down some massive beast by themselves. And this is where you would see like the Mamilo and the Retarii type, with the Retarii being the that should have been the individual that has the net, if I recall correctly. But they would have these gladiators work as team to take down a giant beast, and that was a big thing for the public to see. They loved it.
Yeah, Rotarius is a net fighter.
Yeah, see, there we go. And Retarii would be the plural form, so that's what it is. That's what it would be. So yes, this would go on for a while. Crazy thing about this with the animals, though, is that for anyone who's listened to the episode that we did on the history of zoos and bestiaries and all those kinds of things, weirdly enough, when a Roman beastmaster, and yes, that's actually the term of what it would be here, is a beastmaster would come into town in a place, they would set up their shop, so to speak, which would be the animals in their cages, just kind of out in the public for the public to see. And they would kind of set up their own zoo where they could charge people to come and see the animals, maybe for some of the more docile ones as a kind of petting zoo, this own kind of thing where it was a form of entertainment. Of course, this is not like nowadays where they have significantly better care. If for anyone who knows the history of zoos who listened to that episode, if they didn't get slaughtered in the arena, they don't last long in those cages. They die very quickly anyway.
Yes, on the subject of animals and gladiators, were there any gladiators who were also charioteers?
Actually, that's a great question. Usually, I don't think so. There may have been examples, that ones that we are lost to history, but charioteers were their own other kind of superstar. And generally speaking, in chariot races, they were even bigger individuals. In fact, the wealthiest athlete in history was a charioteer. And I cannot for the life of me remember how much. Gabby, right now, wealthiest athlete in history. It's going to be a chariot guy. And I believe that he was based out of Constantinople in the Hippodrome. I cannot remember what his worth was, though. But they estimated this based on a number of different documents or things that they found, and it's insane. Here, can you give her the mic?
Gaius Appuleius Diocles, 2nd century AD, he participated in over 4,000 races and won 1,460 of them, and he earned approximately 35 million sestertii as engraved on his monument throughout his career. So that was from Medium.
Okay.
So.
Okay, but 35,000 sesterces, what was that equivalent of? This is where it gets really weird because they have to do comparisons for what something is approximately worth, and prices for different things fluctuate over time. So, quick. Oh, you got it. In here. Ewan, pass it behind.
Yeah, the number I found was $15 billion.
Okay. So, yes, there you have it. Using the kind of rough equivalent of what they have, that is worth more than literally any athlete in history. Gabby, did you just say? She just mumbles in the back. I'm going to beat him. I don't play a sport, but I will. Gabby. So, yes, they would... So they would use these beasts, as I said, to specifically have their own kind of little petting zoos and everything else in here, as well as bleeding zoos, so to speak. And the thing that we should note about this is that the death matches and the bestiary games still result in fatalities for fighters on occasions. And these fighters were often contested using slave gladiators or reliefs, as they came to be known, not the actual gladiators themselves that were properly trained. Now, this shift in perception and performance of the games meant that gladiators, both foreign, Roman, and everything else, would enjoy a tremendous boost to their quality of life. It was a really big deal. it was something that was massively successful for them. But here's the problem. The empire doesn't last forever. It doesn't. And so even as bestiary trainers and gladiator ludus masters and state senators who could donate massive numbers of gladiators to their respective, training grounds in order to be able to boost their own reputation, wasn't going to last. Really, no, I will say this as a side note, because this was a question that was asked about whether or not it kept up even after the fall of the Roman Empire. It did. In many cases, those specifically dealing with beasts imported for their own kind of menagerie and public slaughter, that continued all the way going into like the 6th century. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell, it would happen under the Lombard kings initially. Or not Lombard, Visigothic. Yeah, Visigothic. That's the term for what we would have here. What would you say? Yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that here because I don't know if treatment was better off the top of my head.
I mean, even 150 years ago, we had bear baiting and cock rings and things like that, where basically it's like chickens would fight each other to death.
Yeah, still happens, especially in places like Hong Kong and others. Like it's still a very common thing. And so while the games would carry on from 264 BC all the way through roughly 404 CE, it was the Roman Emperor Honorius that marked the end to this iconic aspect of the Roman society. By 398 CE, Honorius had put a halt to the various different ludi of the then very expansive and vast empire, citing that it was really fucking expensive. Because here's the thing. Remember, it's no longer the private trainers. It's no longer all those individuals. It's a state organization. It's bread and circuses, exactly as you said earlier. So since this is something that is being funded by the state, and the state has not expanded in the previous 200 years, they have no new sources of income. There's no new major big sources of slaves except when putting down an uprising somewhere. This means that you're not going to have vast influxes of wealth to be able to fuel these games, which means that they start to kind of fade away. And that tax upon the citizens, that tax upon the treasury, means less money that can go to defenses. And so it starts to get closed down. And from that, nearly 1,600 different schools across the empire get shut down. And so when Telemachus, a monk hailing from Asia Minor, would crash the games, stopping an ongoing fight between two gladiators, which is an event that happened, the very angry crowd responded by stoning the monk to death where he stood in the arena. Not only are decrees happening by virtue of the emperor, but also by the fact that a number of different Christian elements within society here are wanting to put a stop to them. Because no longer is Christianity being discriminated against like it once was. It is the official, religion of the empire. But that doesn't mean everything is going to change culturally. And in fact, this is one of the interesting things when it's talking about the early history of Christianity, is that specifically elements of it became significantly more martial as time went on. Because you know how we have this idea of the Crusades and everything in here, right? Early Christianity was super pacifistic and hippie-like, to the point that it wasn't just turn the other cheek. It was, oh, there's a person that is currently stabbing my child to death. I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to try to restrain them and stop them, but I'm not going to take a weapon and stab them. And if they stab me, well, guess what? That means that we're now martyrs and we get a free pass to heaven. That was a genuine belief, which in the early days would cause many early Christian cult sects to actively try to get themselves arrested and executed so that they could get a free pass to heaven. And in this case, they saw the gladiatorial games as an evil pagan practice that needed to end. And so a number of monks precisely did this to try and stop them. So from Spartacus to Critias to Commodus, all of these varying different entities, all these different figures that were famous within the gladiatorial games, we all remember them, but in the end, they too would come to pass. So from that actually ends our story on gladiators. This has been definitely more of a big overall look at all this rather than the specific types or other things going into us, but considering that we're approaching the 50-minute mark here at this point, I don't think that we're going to be able to go into a lot of details before we keel over here from sweat. So before we finish off this, Any questions, any comments, any things that we want to go into from varying different members of the audience?
I thought your comparison to wrestling was kind of interesting, actually, because nowadays, I think everybody knows that wrestling isn't real. It's real in that you can get hurt, and they do get hurt, but, it's a very persona-based thing. Back then, was there ever a time where people kind of caught onto it a little bit, to some degree or another, where they're like, it's a bit of a show more so than an actual combative fight?
Yes. 100%. And they knew. They already knew, because unless it was a duel between two, here's the thing, there would be a winner, but the whole purpose of it was a genuine fight. It wasn't scripted for who was going to win or lose in the case of a duel, usually, but they would try to make it as grandiose and as entertaining as possible. You're not just going to have a person who's going to be sitting there guarding the entire time. They're going to be doing big movements. They're going to be trying to make it as entertaining for the crowd as they can, while also still trying to win. There were others that were 100% scripted for when they would do this, and this would be when they would try to recreate historical battles, because if there is one thing that the Romans really, really loved, it was war, and the other thing that they really, really loved was talking about that war. So they would put on these massive theatrical performances with gladiators recreating historical battles from their past. We're talking circumstances where everyone knows the fun fact about them flooding the Colosseum in order to be able to recreate naval battles. They would also do things where they would have chariot fights within there to recreate ancient battles of old, and from battles dealing with like the Scythians and other people. Yeah, the Britons as well. They would do this with all the varying different groups. So yes, there were fights that were 100% scripted, and they would do so to tell a story. Yes.
Assuming they lived long enough, what did retirement look like for a gladiator? Or was that even an option?
For anyone who's actually seen the movie like Gladiator, and you see the scene of the Ludus Master and how he had received his own blade, he was a former gladiator himself who got his freedom. That was a real possibility for those that were slaves. You could earn your freedom, especially for those that were debt slaves. If you were a debt slave, once you had paid off your amount, you could leave. You could go. Now, at that point, do you have anything that is left for you? Do you have a family that is waiting on you? Has it been 5-6 years and all of them have passed? Are you a foreigner that is trapped in this land, unable to do anything else, and this is the only thing you know? For many of them, maybe they earned enough money from it. Maybe they earned enough things that they could start their own business, but it's going to be different for each and every individual person. But for many of them, it was the life they knew. And once, if they were successful enough and they had achieved celebrity status, that's what they would do. A number of them would even go on to become masters themselves and train their own gladiators.
So there was a trope of one of the combatants being drugged. How prevalent is that?
Of drugged? I mean, if you're talking about the whole thing, what happened in like the Gladiator movie, and we see this with Commodus doing that action, I don't know off the top of my head if we have any actual records of that happening. There can be a case, of course, of someone trying to fix a fight, because for as many times as these gladiatorial games were done for entertainment, it was a casino. They were gambling on these matches. So there very well could be cases where people were sabotaged in order to make the outcome of a bet more likely or certain. Anyone else?
So the scripted plays, were they more like the Victorian plays where they actually got stabbed on purpose and just had to survive if they got the bad part, or did they fight whatever they could? Is there any?
There could be multiple examples of, say, ones that were actual just like slaves, like war criminals that were thrown into something as a sacrificial, like they actually die and get killed. There were cases where they would have gladiators dress up as proper Roman soldiers in formation and just slaughter an enemy, an opponent, to show their might and power, etc., to break them apart. In others, it would be way more dramatic and drawn out, where they would get stabbed, or they would get, not even stabbed, but a slash, and you can get slashed across the chest, and it causes a lot of blood to flow, but it's not a deep enough wound to actually, kill or debilitate you, but you fall over dead. But yes, actual blood would be used in it wasn't like, oh no, we got a pack of sheep's blood or something on here, and it just goes splattering out, like in the case of an old Japanese film.
That was Red Jello, wasn't it? The Japanese films.
Yeah, I know.
So earlier you mentioned stuff about like their blood and sweat. What I remember hearing that was used as like kind of like lotion and products like that.
Yes, they would. So gladiator blood, sweat, and other bodily fluids. You can take that information with what you will. They were specifically used as things for cosmetics for women. It was seen as a thing for an aphrodisiac. It was seen as something that could be used for a variety of different purposes. So it's not the weirdest thing from what they would do. Like, here's the thing. We did a whole episode on like cosmetics and things throughout history in here. And one of the big things that was used at this time, like they used crocodile dung like the Egyptians did as a contraceptive by shoving it up their hoo-ha. Okay. That was a thing that was done. Like they made a plug out of crocodile poop. Okay. That was a thing. So gladiator blood, sweat, and other bodily fluids, that could be used as a thing, as a lotion for the face. It could be used as a thing to be mixed into a tincture in order to be able to be drunk or something for an aphrodisiac, for other kinds of purposes. Really, the possibilities are endless if your imagination is good enough.
Who was in charge of like the ceremonies themselves? Who would set up like the order for the day? Was it the ludus? Was it the state? The emperor himself?
It's actually a great question on here. It's going to vary depending upon where it's going to be located. If something is being done within like the Colosseum, the ones who oversee all of that is like the Senate itself. Or after that, the emperor who would order it. Now they're going to be able to delegate it to people that are going to be under them. But specifically like in the days prior to the emperor taking control of all of it, it would have been varying different people who would have actually won the position or been elected to it or been delegated the task. Because forgot the third thing that Romans loved besides war and telling stories about war was bureaucracy. Well, with that, my friends, I think that we're going to go ahead and end things here today because we are approaching the 1 hour mark, and I think it's been a successful time here. This has been the first live episode that we have done. Damn it, fumbling right at the end. First live episode that we have done for the History of Everything podcast. I want to thank each and every one of you who have joined me on this. I know at this point, it's like the second to last day before it is that we all head out. And some of you have actually been around since the Japan trip that we did. And I think that this is going to be a fun tradition that we do for all other future trips. So thank you all for joining us. Well, the sauna. Okay. My wife is saying like the sauna is the fun tradition. No. Well, hey, next time we do Japan, we'll do this in the onsen. Yeah. Yeah, in the onsen. Anyway, goodbye, my friends. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye, guys.